Bapak, Ibu, and our beloved students, welcome to the second International Lecture Week hosted by BINUS Business School, BINUS University. There are a total of 40 distinctive virtual sessions, which create a memorable virtual learning experience together with 40 overseas universities from 17 countries. These sessions will be divided into research forum and guest lecture sessions only for Binusians, as well as sessions that are open for public, just like what we have now. To ensure your attendance and to show gestures of respect to our speaker, I would like to ask your cooperation to turn on your video during the sessions. Okay, we are here because we're really excited to know the critical review on the relationship of enterprise and digital world. We do hope that our event today will be fruitful for you. But before we start our sessions, I would like to read again the house rules during this guest lecture today. Please maintain ethical conduct during this event. Please mute your microphone during the seminar unless the moderator asks you to unmute it. If you want to ask questions, you can type in the chat box and the moderator will read it for you, or please use the raise hand features to ask questions during the Q&A sessions. Kindly fill the feedback form. This is for SAT and certificate purposes. Okay, the link will be given in the chat box later on after the sessions. Okay, Bapak, Ibu, and our beloved students, we are so grateful and blessed to have distinguished guest lecturers who are expert in the topic of enterprise and digital world. I'd like to introduce our guest lecturer today, Dr. Tom Fine. He was recruited by Suffolk Business School in January 2012. In addition to his lecturing, supervisions, and research responsibilities, Dr. Tom currently leads Suffolk Business School doctoral program. He has numerous publications and received several awards and honors, such as in 2010, Dr. Tom won the Doctoral Students Award courtesy of Australasian Caucus of the Standing Conference and Organizational Symbolism. And recently in 2018, he also won an Entrepreneurial Initiative of the Year, Suffolk Business School Consultancy. And for teaching and learning activity, Dr. Tom currently leads several modules such as consultancy management with international business, as well as supervises for PhD students. He also has lots of experience of working with professionals, manage a team, and project managers. To paraphrase all of these informations, Dr. Tom Fine today's our guest lecturers is one of the greatest sources for enterprise and digital world topic. So without further ado, please help me in welcoming Dr. Tom Fine, our guest lecturers. Dr. Tom, the floor is yours.
My sincere thanks, Ibu Juliana. It's an honor to be here. I really do appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all. Now, I realize that it's 5:30 there in Jakarta. It's still the morning here in the UK, so I realize that you guys are probably coming to the end of your day and feeling a bit tired. So I shall do my very best to keep this as brief as possible. I intend to speak for about half an hour or so, and then I would welcome questions at that point. Now, I don't think I have control of the slide deck, so I will.
Yeah, Lily will help you. Miss Lily
okay,
will help you to run the slides.
That's terrific.
Okay.
I'll let you know when to move. Okay, hi there. Hi. Yeah. Okay, so I'm here today to talk to you about enterprise and the digital world. And I understand many of you are students of enterprise or entrepreneurship, and many more, I suspect, are on broader business and management degree programs. So I hope this will be of relevance to you. I should stress at the outset that my focus here is not on the technicalities associated with digital enterprise, but I am presenting an alternative and a critical evaluation of this relationship, which I hope will be interesting and food for thought, even if it doesn't have any immediate practical applications to you. It will enable you to think about the future a little bit differently. Thank you. So we've moved on to the second slide now. So digital technologies, I say here, are usually considered to be desirable and to be important prerequisites for successful enterprise. In this session, I want to adopt a more critical stance. So I've used here an image of, this is an Amish community in Pennsylvania in the United States. And the Amish are famous because they took a decision, or their community is premised on the idea that they conduct their lives in accordance with 18th century technology. So they don't move beyond the technology that was available at a certain period in history. So they've taken the decision to say, well, we are going to reject technological advance. And of course, this means digital technologies as well, because we want to preserve our way of life as much as possible. So I put here, we will endeavour to explore and understand the emerging resistance against technologies in general, before focusing on the emerging resistance against digital technologies in particular. So I'm interested in why not everybody is so welcoming and encouraging of new technologies, and particularly digital technologies, and how this sort of reaction may well shape our world, and what this poses to us as entrepreneurs of the future. Okay, if we could move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so emerging resistance to technologies. What the sorts of questions I want to look at here. Are we witnessing an increased resistance to corporate power? Are we experiencing a revival of the craftsman? 3, might a retrograde or sort of a reverse view of technology? Might a retrograde technological future be more desirable? And is the concept of a post-growth economy relevant to discussions of retrograde technology? If we could move on to the next slide, please. So, are we witnessing an increased resistance to corporate power? So what we have here, so in the year 2000, a journalist by the name of Naomi Klein published a book called No Logo, Brands, Globalization, Resistance. And this became a bestseller, and it's still used on degree programs today in the UK and indeed elsewhere, even though it is over 20 years old, because I think one of the messages that it contains is considered so important from a critical perspective. So what does Naomi Klein argue? Well, she argues that we live in this increasingly globalized world. But the problem with this increasingly globalized world is that corporations seem to have more and more power, and seem to be in a position now where they can manipulate our lives to such an extent that we have become their subjects. They control us from an economic point of view. So this is quite a critical idea. And Valaskivi, in a recent publication, talks about this in relation to innovation. And she says the all-encompassing concept of innovation, which has spread into all spheres of life, can be understood as a contemporary faith or belief system that I call innovationism. At its core is the utopian belief that technological innovations will ultimately solve fundamental challenges faced by humankind, including the threat of death and so on. This enables societies to continue in an economic system based on growth, despite the obvious limits of the planet. So here we begin to see, well, are we just blindly embracing technological advance and innovationism without really thinking through the long-term consequences of doing so? The next slide, please. So, related to this, are we experiencing a revival of The Craftsman? And The Craftsman is a book that was written by sociologist Richard Sennett. It was published 2007 or 2008, so about 12 years old now. And in this book, Sennett argues that over the past, in the post-war period, we have basically witnessed a move away from a respect to craft, and we are embracing mechanization to such an extent that we are losing lots of our skill sets that we have had for hundreds of years. So this is something which Sennett believes is problematic because it represents a potential challenge to the resilience of society. So what Sennett observes is that people are beginning to realize this. Customers, consumers are beginning to realize this, and they are experiencing a rejection of product ubiquity. So I think, I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the Swedish IKEA firm, the Swedish manufacturer of furniture, IKEA. And this, certainly in the UK, IKEA was hugely popular in the 1990s, but its popularity has begun to wane as people are beginning to reject the idea of product ubiquity. They want something, increasingly, or certain sections of the community, of the consumer community, want something that has been produced through the art of craft. Are we experiencing a resurgence in demand for handmade, artisanal, personal products and services, moving away from the Tayloristic approach to scientific management and mass production, and rediscovering the importance of craft? Okay, the next slide, please. Is a retrograde technological future more desirable? This is another image of the Amish in Pennsylvania in the United States. As I said at the beginning, this is a community that have taken the decision not to move beyond a particular type of technology in the interest of preserving their way of life. So I've said here, there's a couple of questions. Is technological advance necessarily inherent to the human condition? There is a belief that what makes us human is that we continually innovate, that we continually embrace technological advance. But there are philosophers and others who are beginning to challenge this question. And perhaps more pertinently, are technological innovations making people unhappy? Is our compulsive use of technology making us unhappy? We see reports of particularly young men who have become addicted to video games. Many of us, I think, are addicted to our smartphones as well. We use those compulsively. Okay, next slide, please. So this begs another question. Is the concept of a post-growth economy relevant? What do we mean, of course, by a post-growth economy? Well, we are used to thinking of or reading the financial pages of our newspapers and our media streams that economic growth, we're used to thinking that as a good thing, i.e. the Indonesian economy expanded by 10% last year would be a great headline. But if the headline was the Indonesian economy has contracted by 10% over the last year, which of course is entirely possible in the case of COVID, that's generally regarded as something negative. But there's now a group of scholars who are saying, well, hang on a minute, is this necessarily such a bad thing? Economic contraction is advantageous from the point of view of ecological sustainability in particular. So the idea of the environment, that we are polluting less. Is perpetual economic growth, A, is it physically possible? And B, if it is it actually desirable? We live in a world where we continually assume that it is desirable. But as I say, there are scholars, there are academics, there are researchers, PhD students who are beginning to challenge this idea and beginning to look at the prospects of a post-growth world and the politics of degrowth as well. Thank you. If we could move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so we've looked at the emerging resistance to general technologies. I now want to look at the emerging resistance to digital technologies, and this is something which my research is focused on. So I want to ask three or explore three questions here. What is the significance of the digital divide? What is the significance of the digital detox? And what do we mean by the concept of the post-digital era, which some of us are beginning to see discussed in the media by journalists, by bloggers, and so on. Okay, if we could move on to the next slide, please. So what then is the significance of what is known as the digital divide? Well, the digital divide describes what is seen by many as a new class system, i.e., we've talked, in the past, Karl Marx famously talked about at the economic divide between the proletariat and the capitalists, the class system, the working class, the middle class, and the owners, for example. Well, today, as we live in a world of digital natives, we live in a world where the internet is pervasive, we live in a world where digital technology encompasses us, but there are, of course, people that don't have access to the internet. There are, of course, people that continue to live their lives without the advantages associated with digital technologies. So the question is, to what extent does the perpetual support, promotion of doing business digitally, is that further disadvantaging those who find themselves on the negative side of the digital divide? Are we further reinforcing a class division? Are we further reinforcing a division between those that do have access to the internet and those that don't? And this is something which I would imagine every country around the world is a problem that they tackle. I don't know what the figures are, but I know in the UK, for example, that only about 90% of people have access to the internet. So there are 10% of the populace, and of course the UK is considered a developed nation where you might expect internet penetration to be extremely high, but there are still 10% of people that don't have access to the internet. So to what degree is this adversely affecting their ability to live their lives? A couple of questions for you. So what nation has more mobile phones per person than any other nation on earth? And which nation drove the selfie stick craze? I suspect many of you know the answer to this. The answer is, of course, Indonesia. So which nation has more mobile phones per person than any other nation on earth? Indonesia. Which nation drove the selfie stick craze? Indonesia as well. So Indonesia is at the forefront of this technological drive, this digital drive. And so it's interesting. I think what we're discussing in today's session is probably quite pertinent for Indonesia in terms of its role in the future as it becomes a much bigger, stronger economy, as it grows at this extraordinary rate that we've seen over the past few years. Okay, moving on to the next slide, please. What is the significance of the digital detox? Now, this is a concept which I came across, I guess, for the first time about 2 years ago. The digital detox. This is something which people were, and I think it's the reaction to a life which is so dominated by digital technologies that we feel them in such a way that they're beginning to have a negative emotional and psychological effect on us. The image here is an image courtesy of an artist that some of you may well be familiar with. He's a British artist from the city of Bristol called Banksy. And he produced this a few years ago. And I think it's quite a telling image in the sense that it implies to us that our reliance and obsession with technology, in this case smartphones, has become so consuming that we do so at the expense of our co-present personal relations. And this, I think, for some individuals at least, has become quite damaging. So I ask the questions here: is our use of digital media becoming compulsive? I know that most evenings before I go to sleep, the last thing I do, I'm reading the news on my mobile phone. My wife is sat next to me and she's doing the same, or she's on Facebook or whatever it happens to be. Both of us are glued to our phones. It's the last thing we do at night. The first thing we do when we wake up, not only are we woken up by the alarm on our phone, but is to check our messages. So it's we now find ourselves in this world where we are underpinned and consumed entirely by digital technologies. And I suspect this is bound to have an effect. So have we become enslaved by digital technology? Should we be concerned about surveillance as well? So increasingly, the use of technology is all very well, it's compulsive and so on and so forth, but who is using this to their advantage? Which corporations are benefiting from this? Unbeknownst to us, is Marx's concept of commodity fetishism relevant here? Marx's concept of commodity fetishism is useful in understanding how commodities, i.e. electronic devices, phones, begin to have power over us. They're abstract devices in some respects. They should be tools that we use for our advantage. But Marx would argue, I think if he were alive today, that the mobile phone, the smartphone, is beginning to entrance us. It has power over us. And this is potentially quite problematic. And it's for all these reasons, I think, that increasingly we're seeing people talk about having a digital detox, talking about going a week without their phone, or a month without their phone, or perhaps a year without their phone, or perhaps abandoning them altogether. And we're seeing this in small numbers, admittedly, at the moment, but it is happening. Why is it happening? Well, it's happening, I suspect, I mean, this is research that psychologists are currently engaged in. It's happening, I suspect, because people believe that we have lost something, that digital technologies have displaced a certain aspect, a key component of the human condition. Next slide, please. What then is the post-digital era? Now, if you Google post-digital era, you typically come across articles such as those presented by Accenture in 2019. And the Accenture piece says that businesses can no longer differentiate or compete on the basis of digital offerings or advantage. They say, no, a digital presence is simply assumed. With this in mind, they argue, it is how effectively businesses use digital data that is most important. And this is what they mean by a post-digital era. In this sense, for the Accenture article and others, the concept of post-digital, i.e. as in after digital, doesn't really make sense. What they're really talking about is an extreme digital era, or the next level digital era. But when I talk of a post-digital era, I think I'm talking about something quite different. And I write here, alternatively, and perhaps more interestingly, is the prospect that we are beginning to see a backlash against digital tech. Alternatively, and perhaps more interesting, is the prospect that we are beginning to see a backlash against digital tech. We are human beings. I've just lost the...
Yeah.
So, it's back. Excellent.
Okay,
we are human beings.
Sorry, Tom. So
no
this
problem.
Is than that before.
No problem. We are human beings. Each generation seeks to distinguish itself from their parents. Will future generations regard digital technologies as deeply old-fashioned and unauthentic? Will they actively seek out off-grid lives? So, my nephew is 21 now, and he is like many of you, a digital native. He was born into a world where the internet was an everyday part of life. My daughter is only 2, and she is really a generation on from my nephew. And I wonder whether when she grows up, the idea of digital technologies will seem quite old-fashioned, and will be seen as almost unauthentic, will be seen as an excuse for moving away from genuine, interactive, interhuman relations. And what we're seeing in some parts of the world is people actively seeking out what are called off-grid existences, where they are rejecting the idea of a society with this immersive connectivity associated with the digital world. And some of the research that's coming out of the Cabinet Office here in the UK at the moment during COVID is saying one of the reactions that they're anticipating and currently planning for is a huge amount of urban to rural migration, because of course we are now communicating electronically. There seems to be less desire for people to live in cities because of course housing is so much more expensive. So that's part of it, certainly. But I think what they're also anticipating is that people are using COVID as an opportunity to say, do you know what, I don't want to be in a city anymore. I don't want to be immersed in the rat race, and I want to move into this sort of off-grid existence. And I see now as an opportunity to do that. So that there is I have no idea if something similar is happening in Indonesia, but certainly in the UK, what's happening is that property prices in the major cities are going down, whilst property prices in the more rural areas are beginning to go up. And this has happened since COVID hit. As people begin to retreat, they're beginning to look to carve out an existence which is more independent and more resilient should another pandemic strike. Okay, if we could just move on then. So, what does all this mean for entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship students? So I've rabbited on for quite some time now, 25 minutes or so.
Because we have some entrepreneurship hatchery students over here, Tom. They come from different programs. Sure,
okay. I understand. Thank you very much for the clarification. So, thus far, what I've been talking about is quite general. I'm talking about societal trends, and I'm talking quite prospectively about shifts in attitude on a sociological level. But of course, the point of this session is to ask, well, how is this relevant to students of business, to students of entrepreneurship? If we can move on to the next slide, please.
Okay. We have also computer science students over here.
Interesting.
Who are taking the entrepreneurship hatchery for now.
Interesting. Well, I'll be certainly interested to hear what their views are on this sort of thing. So what then are the implications of all of this? Well, I think it's probably fair to say that successful enterprises know their customers well. Now, if some customers are beginning to resist products and services realized by advanced digital technologies, perhaps they'll need to revisit their strategy. So just to remind you, why might they be resisting products and services which have been made by advanced digital technologies? Well, it's because certainly we're beginning to see this desire for handmade, or this resurgence for handmade, personal, artisanal products come to the fore again. But this begs several more specific questions. Which industries are most likely to see a customer-led resistance towards digital technologies? How might enterprise ready themselves for the post-digital era? And what enterprise opportunities might there be to serve a customer base that prefers products and services delivered via retrograde technologies? So these are the sorts of questions that we might want to think about, certainly for you guys in the future, as you begin to hit the ground. Of course, the vast majority of your work will continue as normal, but I think it's important to be aware of this undercurrent societal change. So, look, guys, thank you. Sincere thanks for your time. I think I've spoken for about half an hour now.
Yeah.
And as I say, this was a critical evaluation, so probably quite different to what you're used to. But I would be interested to hear from any of you, any points or any questions that you may have.
Right. Okay. Yes, Bapak Ibu, we are now in questions and answer sessions. Thank you, Tom, for your explanations. I'm really sorry because I just informed you that we have several computer science students over here today. Okay, Bapak Ibu, yes, no we have here. We have Priska Aulia, who is raising her hand. Okay, Priska, do you have any questions related with the presentations, Tom's presentations before?
Yes, thank you, Miss Jube, and good evening, everyone. Good morning, Professor Fine. My name is Priska, and I'm student of International Business in BINUS JWC Senayan. So, as we know from your previous presentation, that digital technologies give a significant impact toward people's behavior, and I have read this case study about how software could replace managers. So they created a prototype software as a virtual management system that automates complex work by dividing it into small individual tasks. And I want to know, do you think if technologies keep growing this way in digital era, do you think the IT development will be dangerous for us? Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ibu Priska. That's a very interesting question. And this is one that my own students often ask me, or something very similar, because of course there are discussions about artificial intelligence. Funnily enough, last year when I was visiting BINUS University, I did a session on artificial intelligence there, and we had an interesting discussion after that. But I think this question about technology, what you're hinting at here is the prospect of technology in terms of job displacement, and the degree to which jobs will begin to be lost because they go back. Right. Okay. Now, so this is something I discussed with my own MBA students on our organizational behavior module. And what we see periodically is the same fear. So this is a fear which dates back to, funnily enough, the Industrial Revolution in Britain in the 1700s and 1800s. And there was a group of individuals who became known as the Luddites. Okay, some of you may be familiar with the concept of the Luddites. If you're not, they're well worth looking up. And what the Luddites did is that they reacted negatively against the introduction of mechanization. Hi guys, can you hear me?
Yeah, thank you, Tom. Thank you. I'm so glad.
Sorry. I'm so sorry about that. I'm so sorry. It's because I'm bad-mouthing technology. It's getting its own back.
Okay, sorry. I need to turn out the music first. Excuse me. Yes, Tom.
Okay, so my apologies for that. So I was responding to Ibu Priska, who raised a really interesting question about job displacement, and I was saying how this is a fear that dates back to the 1800s, really, in the UK, and it was a group called the Luddites, and the Luddites became famous for resisting the introduction of mechanization in the textile industry in the UK. And what did the Luddites do? Well, they smashed up the looms and all the machinery associated with the textile industry, because they saw that machinery as a threat to their livelihood, their jobs. And we see this sort of reaction every time there's a new technology. We see this sort of reaction. because people are fearful of losing their job. And I think the introduction of artificial intelligence is just the latest technology that elicits this fear. What it should be reassuring, I think, is that history teaches us that although initially there is job displacement, ultimately there is job creation as well.
Right.
And so although we can be fearful that jobs will be lost, we know that they will be created. So I think this is just really one of those examples of how, you know, it's a universal truth associated with the world, that it's in a perpetual state of change and evolution, and the job market is no different. So in response to that concern, I would have to say, please don't be concerned, because yes, of course, there will be job displacement, but my guess is the economy will adapt and move forward, as it has done historically for hundreds of years with the introduction of each new technology.
Okay. Next one, Tom, because the topic is very interesting. Some students are quite eager to ask you some questions. Okay, from
Sure.
Andrea Sukardi. It's super interesting so far, but instead of abandoning phones or technology entirely, why not just limit the use? This can be done by self-control or downgrading the lower tech phones so that they can at least still take calls or take messages in the event or emergency.
Sure. So, I mean, there's 2 points there, isn't there? So there's one that we can limit use, and I think lots of us try to do that ourselves. We try to discipline ourselves in terms of our use of technology. So I know my wife, for example, just tries to limit her use of her phone to 2 hours a day. And she does that to discipline herself. I think it rarely ever works. I'm pretty sure each day she mainly uses more than 2 hours. I mean, clearly you could implement that by way of legislation, but I don't think that would go down well with the populace. So yes, I see how limitation could be helpful, and I think it probably comes from education, that perhaps rather than turn our back on digital technologies, it's learning how to moderate our use, and perhaps that will come in time, quite possibly. But I think that technologies seem to be like anything else, in that most of us can approach their use responsibly, but there will always be people who fall into a trap of compulsive use. The other point is about using older style phones, so pre-smartphone phones. And of course, this is the idea. This is similar to the Amish approach, which is saying, well, we are going to limit ourselves to a particular technology. And at that point, we're going to draw the line and say, this is where we say, we will use the technologies up until this date. So for example, up until, I don't know, 2005, but we are going to reject technologies from this point on, which of course is another approach. I'm not sure. The simple answer is yes, they could be potential approaches. What are the commercial ramifications? Well, perhaps this is something that enterprise students, that IT students want to think about, that if people begin to curb their use of technology or begin to moderate their use of technology, what business opportunities are presented by that.
Okay, thanks, Tom. We have another one from Richard Devlin. Richard, would you please ask?
All right. So okay. First of all, good afternoon, guys, and good morning to Professor Vine. I'd like to ask you on the implications of the digital world to entrepreneurship students like me. Here's the thing, as entrepreneurs, we're always trying to be 2 steps ahead of the world, basically, which can get a little weird. But I'm asking you this, what if we started to make businesses that are less reliant on technology? What if we started to do businesses that are less compliant to the way technology is going? Because I see this as a sort of a danger, because anything that could basically go up quickly, it could very well go down quickly as well. And I'm actually planning to make a business that can go when technology is going forward, but it can also go when technology is going backwards. Would you think that that's a good idea, Professor Vine? Thank you so much.
Richard, a very good morning or good afternoon to you, I should say, and an interesting, another interesting question. So, I suppose I ought to clarify that what I'm not trying to predict the future here. I'm not saying that what we are going to see in 10 years' time is a wholesale rejection of technological advance. I think it would be foolish for me to predict something like that. But what I can say with some confidence, because we're already seeing trends of this happening, is that there is a resurgence for more traditional approaches to a livelihood. There is a resurgence to traditional approaches to producing products. Now, as a student of enterprise, that you are thinking of developing an organization, a business, which is quite responsive to shifts in technology, I think can only be a good thing, because what you're doing there is saying, well, I am putting together an organization, a business, which has a really firm resilience to shifts in how people choose to live their lives. I think it might be more useful to think about this in terms of demographics, in terms of in having different segments in a market. So you'll be familiar, I would imagine, if you've studied a marketing module, of how you segment your market. And I suspect what we will see is that there will be an increasingly larger segment of that market that is looking for these sorts of products and services that have not so much turned their back, but perhaps there is a bigger question mark over technological advance, and they are perhaps more concerned about the all-encompassing effects of technological advance. And I suppose what I'm saying to you as students of enterprise is this is probably a segment which is going to be quite lucrative. So it's probably something that you might want to think about for the future. Richard, I hope that's useful. As I say, I'm not trying to predict the future. I'm just trying to anticipate particular trends that may well be useful to you guys in the future.
Okay. All right. I hope it answers your questions, Richard. Yeah. Okay. Next one we have from Christelle Emmanuel. Tom, how's your view about fighting financial crime or fraud in an increasingly digital world?
So what is my view of well, I suppose I don't know that I'm necessarily qualified to answer that question, because finance isn't my field. But from what I understand, digital, the shift towards digital finance has, of course, made the speed of transactions much faster and much more convenient. But it has, of course, opened up huge pockets of abuse within that system. I think. Who can say, frankly, as to whether a retrograde technological shift may well improve matters in terms of financial crime? I honestly can't say, because it's not something that I am qualified to answer.
Okay, I understand that, Tom. I understand. Thank you very much, Tom. Okay, next one we have Aurelie Shifalia. Would you please turn on your camera? Then you can directly ask Tom. Thanks, Aurelia.
Okay. Hello, and how are you? I just want to...
I'm okay, thank you. How are you? How are you?
I'm good.
Good.
So I just want to ask you that I recently watched a movie about social dilemma on Netflix, and it's about what you say about limit your social media intake. But I think it's not about limit your social media intake, because I think it's more purposeful or mindful if you use your platform to uplift others and to inspire others. And I think, what do you think about your healthy relationship with the social media, so you can empower others with your social media and get creative and not overwhelmed or overconsumed by the news because of the COVID thing.
Okay, it's an interesting point, certainly. But I think
Tom, we cannot hear you clearly, Tom. I'm really sorry, we cannot hear clearly.
Can you hear me now?
Not really.
It's just small.
Yeah, we cannot hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Still not yet.
I don't know. It may well be a problem with my internet connection. I don't know.
I see.
I can hear you, but
barely hear you though.
My internet connection looks fine. I don't know. Can you
it's
hear
okay.
me now?
I can hear you. I can hear you, but it's just a small voice.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Somebody's suggesting it might be a microphone problem. I don't think so. I don't know. Okay. So in response to that question, I think social media, like all technologies, like all digital technologies, is a double-edged sword. By which I mean that clearly it brings enormous benefits and connectivity and a sense of solace in a world which is quite isolating, particularly at the moment.
Wait, Tom, can you?
Can you? Can't hear me. I'm not. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Because we barely hear you.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm really sorry, Bapak Ibu, for the technical problems. We are still Tom had 3 sessions before. He has a research forum before, so this is his 3rd sessions. So perhaps the internet's also tired.
You can't hear me, no? No.
We barely can hear you, okay. Tom. Okay. Yeah. As I informed you before, we have guest lecture sessions as well as research forum for lectures. And Tom was panelist for the research forum before. 2 research forums was attended by him. Okay. So please be patient, Bapak Ibu. Okay, Tom. Are you there?
I don't know if you can hear me, but I think it must be a connectivity issue.
Good. We can hear you now.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. Terrific. Well, I will try. I will continue talking. The internet connection may go down again, but we'll see. Okay. So in response, then, I think social media, like any other technology, is a double-edged sword. By which I mean it is. There are advantages. It provides a sense of security and solace in a fairly isolating world, and of course this is very true in the current pandemic. But on the other hand, social media is a forum for an enormous amount of cruelty, is a forum for extremely controversial and radical opinions. It propagates all sorts of terrorist activities and so on and so forth, which can be quite damaging as well. So I think that my personal approach to social media is that I avoid it. So I think I turned off my Facebook account in 2011, and I haven't had a social media account since. That's not to say that I don't see the value. And my wife has several social media accounts, and I realize that they are of extraordinary value to lots of people. But personally, I felt that it was invasive. I felt that it wasn't making me a happy human being. But I think everybody has to make their own decisions on that.
Okay. Right.
You know, I see the benefits, but I also see the disadvantages.
Okay. Yeah. Tom. Okay. Is that answering your questions, Aurelia?
Yeah. I agree with your opinion because I do a social media detox and I felt so happy and freely.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
How often do you do your social media detox?
I do it every month because I feel it's great to just not using your phone that often. Maybe you can be more present to your surroundings and learning something new.
Okay.
Sure. So, and how long, so you do it monthly, and how long will you detox for?
Like 2 weeks or maybe 1 month, some kind of that.
Oh, wow. So quite a long detox then. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Interesting. Okay. Thank you.
Well, Tom, we have 741 participants and we have several questions, but we have limited times. Now
We
it's
do,
24.
yes.
There are several questions again. We have Pasha Tajuddin. Questions: what if AI and machines only replace heavy-duty workers like mining or dangerous chemical manufacturing? Would that be better than machines replacing jobs?
Okay, so I don't know that it would be better or worse, but I can say with some confidence that most of the jobs that are currently a threat from artificial intelligence are not the heavy industries and manufacturing industries, but tend to be jobs in the service sector. They tend to be jobs that jobs like customer complaints operatives, telephonists. Even now, there are suggestions that the doctor, the general practitioner's role, will be rendered to artificial intelligence. So medical students, their future is in danger because the algorithms are so sophisticated now that the job of the doctor to really identify a problem, to diagnose an illness, will be actually more effectively done by the algorithm. And so the GP's role, the doctor's role, is going to have to change so that it becomes more about counseling, more about contact, more about interaction, those sort of emotional components which can't be replicated, or at least can't at the moment, by machines. That will be the shift, that will be the change there. So from what I understand in terms of artificial intelligence, it's actually the service sector jobs which are now most at risk, rather than the manufacturing and heavy industries.
Okay. Since we have still 5 more minutes, Tom, so I'm going to open for 2 more questions. Okay.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay. This is from Gatadi. Hello, sir. In your research about the rise of post and digital era, this is quite interesting. He followed your research, he read your research. Era under currents, what interesting trends or activity did you find people are engaging in that may be interesting or seem counterintuitive, especially in the West?
Okay, that's an interesting question. Okay, so I think one of the things that I find most interesting about research into artificial intelligence is concerns about machine consciousness. So this is considered the pinnacle, if you like, of artificial intelligence, where not only are computers really displacing jobs. Of course, that this is a concern, although, as I said earlier, I don't think this is something we ought to be too worried about, because I think the economy will adapt. I have no doubt about that, in fact. But concerns, and students raise this with me as well, about machine consciousness, and why is the world so preoccupied with concerns about machine consciousness? Well, it's this sort of dystopian belief that machines will take over the world ultimately, that human beings will become enslaved by a machine consciousness, that machines, computers will become like the dominant factor on the planet. Now, the reason why, well, certainly much of the research that I have read has begun to discount this sort of concern. And I should also stress that this concern is reinforced and propagated by films we see, by books we read. So lots of science fiction films talk about this sort of end of days scenario where machines take over the world. This is a sort of a classic dystopian trope in science fiction movies. But what algorithms ultimately can't do is replicate the human ability to operate in what is an essentially an uncertain world. So one of the remarkable human characteristics is an ability to hold two competing views. And psychologists refer to this as cognitive dissonance, this ability to hold conflicting views and not fall over or shut down as a result. So it's only really human beings that can say, okay, well, we've got this happening there and we've got that happening there, and the two are contradictory or conflictual, and they don't conform to a linear form of logic, but I'm a human being and I can deal with that uncertainty and that contradiction and that tension. An algorithm can't. An algorithm simply can't, because it is reliant on a linear logic. And so for that reason, I think, the research that I've looked at would suggest that human beings will remain in their principal role in relation to technology. But my concern is not so much about, as I say, machine consciousness and machines dominating. It's more about humans' relationships with machines in terms of their own well-being. Somebody, one of your peers used the term well-being earlier, and my concern is that technological immersion is really having a negative effect on lots of our well-being. And so it's a question of how do we use it in moderation? How do we use it to make the most out of it without these detrimental effects beginning to harm our interpersonal relationships? That's the tricky question.
Okay, is that answering your questions, Dadia? I hope that answering your questions. This is good because you're following Dr. Tom's research.
That's terrific. Yeah, terrific. Thank you.
He's actually a CS student. Okay, we have one more last questions from Wendy Tarigan. In tourism, satisfying tourist experience is the goal of the product, where human touch is expected most by the tourists instead of served by machines. What do you say about that?
So what, could you repeat the question?
In tourism, satisfying tourist experience is the goal of the product, where human touch is expected most by the tourists instead of served by machines. What do you say about that? This is Wendy. He's a lecturer, business lecturer, perhaps this one, right?
Okay, so
thank you. Last question, Tom.
I would agree 100%. So I think one of the very, very damaging ramifications of the pandemic is, leaving aside obviously the advantages in terms of the environment, is the fact that travel has been limited so much, and that we are struggling. We're not having those experiences of different cultures as tourists or as business travelers, and we're not being able to do that tangibly. And people are talking about having virtual trips, virtual travel, virtual holidays, which clearly there's no replication there, is there, in terms of understanding a culture. I know personally, when I travel to Indonesia, I learned so much which I simply can't learn electronically. And you know what I can't do? I definitely can't do is eat the food. That's what I miss most about Indonesia, is the terrific food. And I can't do that over my laptop, right? Where am I going to get my nasi goreng from? It's not going to happen over the laptop, that's for sure. See, right now, I'm stuck with very bland British food, and that's the most frustrating thing. Okay. So yeah, the human touch is very important, no question.
Okay, thank you very much, Tom. Bapak Ibu, thank you, and all students, thank you so much for participating in this guest lectures, our guest lecture by Dr. Tom Fine. And thank you so much, Dr. Tom, for a very interesting and insightful presentations, as well as there are quite big range of questions that we have
absolutely
from our students. Okay,
it's been terrific.
Yes.
Thank you so much. I really do appreciate it. It's been an honor to be a part of this. Thank you so much, guys, and good luck with your degree programs.
Okay, thank you so much. We are so happy and to have knowledge and insight on the critical review of the relationship between enterprise and the digital world. And we are so grateful and thank you for these valuable sessions.
My absolute pleasure.
Thank you very much, Tom. Before we end our sessions, I would like to share to all the participants the 700. Wait, I need to check this one. 732 participants that joined this quite big, Tom. Quite big. Okay.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys.
Today. And participant, I would like to remind you again to fill in the form. We have shared the link in the form. This is for SAT and certificate purposes. And before we end our session today, I would like to ask for your help to turn on all your camera. Miss Lily, boleh dibantu later? Would you please help me? Turn on all the camera. Okay. We have 30, so bear with me, Bapak Ibu. We have 30 pages, so bear with me. We are going to screenshot one by one, okay? Thank you. Smile. Okay, next one. All right. Again. Okay, while I'm in.
Too many pages.
Yeah, too many pages because we have 723 right now.
I already done. Take the screenshot.
Okay, thank you very much, Pak Arifandi.
Thank you, Pak Arif.
Very much, everyone. Thank you very much, Dr.
Thank you, guys. Take care. Good luck now.
We are so thankful that you are here and explain us everything. Okay.
Pleasure. Thank you, Evangeliana. Thank you for hosting.
Stay safe, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye.